And that way we. All right. We are quickly creeping up the ticker here as more and more folks join. Welcome, welcome. We'll give folks a moment or two before we get started. Welcome, welcome. Austin, Texas in the house. I love it. All right. Okay, let's get this show on the road. We've got a lot to cover. Thank you so much for being here today. I know this session has had an interesting journey to it, and I can't thank you enough. So for everyone listening and watching, could you first please school us all on the right way to pronounce your name?
Sure. So, happy Dalit History Month, everyone. My name is Thenmozhi Soundararajan. So the ZHI is like a Ra. And I've heard every version of that name, Tanuja, including Tamari Soundgarden, which sounds like a combination of like if I was like my wrestler name or my porn name, we don't know. But honestly, I think Thenmozhi would be great.
Great. Sounds good. Understood. Well, it's wonderful to have you here. For those who I don't know, my name is Thenmozhi Gupta. I'm based here in New York and work at Google, and really thrilled that we could bring you this talk today. So let's first start with it. You said this is Dalit History Month. What does the term Dalit mean?
Sure. So, I think to really understand what the term Dalit means, we actually have to define what caste is, because we are, our origination of who we are as a people really came out of our resistance to, one of the largest systems of exclusion in the world, which is caste apartheid. And, for folks that haven't, been familiar with this before this talk, caste, is a system of exclusion analogous to race. It has its origins in South Asia, and it is a system that's based on exclusion both by birth, because you are born into a particular family. That family has a caste, and that determines your spiritual purity and therefore the profession that you have. So, there is discrimination both in terms of birth, work, and descent. And so, caste has, impacts all of the countries in South Asia. So there's close to 1.9 billion people that live under this system of exclusion. And it determines the whole of your life, from who you marry, where you live, your proximity to violence, and your experiences of structural exclusion and bias. It's why, many people who are caste oppressed, like myself, we consider the system of caste one of the oldest systems of oppression in the world. But our people represent one of the oldest lineages of resistance. And at the heart of that is why we were called ourselves Dalit. Because originally under the caste system, meaning that to touch us, other castes would become spiritually polluted. So, we were shunted into this caste apartheid of separate places to live, separate places of worship, and treated as other, because basically not only were we untouchable, but we were seen as defiled before God. And nobody gets to determine your worth, before the divine. That is something that is personal. It is our human right to have our own religious freedom and expression in that way. And so many untouchables view untouchable a term as an epithet. And instead, we call ourselves Dalit, which means, one who has been broken but is resilient. And I think that, Tanuja, is, many people who have caste oppressed workers in their workplaces, people might identify as Dalit. They also may identify as a religion or not identify as all at all, because these systems, whether it's like white supremacy or caste, they function by removing our choices, and they function by removing consent. So part of us calling ourselves Dalit or whatever name we choose is part of us reasserting back our humanity in the face of such dehumanization.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving that. I know it's such a complex topic, but you've got the summary nails. When I want to talk about your resilience specifically, because today this is a personal conversation, and I know, we're both have Indian history. Our parents have immigrated. Tell us a little bit about kind of your history, from learning about your own history to the activist that you are now.
Well, part of why it brings me so much joy to celebrate Dalit History Month, together now, is it was a holiday and a month I wish I had growing up. Because, again, I grew up in the United States. I was, a California girl. I grew up in like Huntington Beach, which, I don't know if you guys know, is like Surf City. But it was a funny time to grow up there, because I think, Tanuja, our parents are probably a similar generation, but, many of the Indian families that came as part of the brain drain in the 70s,
Mhm.
got to benefit from civil rights wins from, that led to a diversification of immigration. And my parents not only, were some of the first doctors that came to Los Angeles that were Indian, they were actually some of the first doctors from, Dalit communities, because they got affirmative action back at home.
Mm.
And I think they imagined that when they came here, that caste was in the rear view. They were going to just live their lives and finally be in a country that saw them for the humans that they were. And I think what was terrifying, watching caste recreate itself here, and that's a big part of my experience, is that many of these bedroom South Asian communities that are made up of professionals and I think people felt a lot of racism from white supremacy. And so as they recreated their cultural networks, they re-encasted them as well. So many community institutions, religious institutions, even parental networks and gatherings are organized by caste. In fact, I was talking to one of our members, and she was telling me how in Chicago, the parents groups there are actually organized by caste. So there's the Brahmin parents WhatsApp group, the Kshatriya parents WhatsApp group. And it's terrifying for me, because when I grew up in California, I remember being bullied by other dominant caste children. And, I remember I had the parents of a friend switch out plates because they didn't want me to eat on their plates because I would pollute them. And when I got to college, I faced a lot of open slurs and other forms of gaslighting, because I was really out as a Dalit and proud, because I saw that, I was like, why would I hide? I'm in freaking Los Angeles, and I went to Berkeley, which was like home of the, and Oakland, which was home of the Dalit Panthers. So there's no way, Black Panthers. And so why would I hide, when I have every right to be able to express my community history? But I think experiencing those things, I can't tell you how heartbreaking it is. It's heartbreaking when people make stereotypes and judgments about you, when people diminish the loss of life in your community, which is often happens to Dalit people. And, there's a lot of times where I cried and also felt really alone, because very few people could be out like me and had the privilege to do that. A privilege that was bought with my parents' trauma, because again, they came with so much violence that they never had a space to talk about their own experiences of caste discrimination. And that's why I was out, was I wanted other people not to experience what I went through. But it was heartbreaking, Tanuja. And I think this is part of why we founded Equality Labs, is we want a structural response. It's not the burden of individual oppressed people to have to name and explain these issues. We need to be able to, have civil rights be implemented for all of us. And I think the heart of, my journey as a leader is that What I experienced, I never wanted to have happen again, especially because when I went to school at Berkeley,
Mm,
not only did I go through my own caste cases, but the city of Berkeley was actually the site of one of the first legal cases involving an employer related to caste.
mm.
Because at that time, the second largest landlord in the city of Berkeley was this guy named Lucky Bali Reddy. And he was someone who basically trafficked over 300 employees, many of them under the first usages of the H-1B visa,
Mm.
because this was in early 2000s. And of those employees, several of those employees were young girls as young as 13 who he exploited as his sex slaves. And the weirdest thing about it is that, especially, this is something Dalit people really know intimately, is that even though the exploitation and the violence of us might be happening completely in the open, because people don't see us, it's almost like it doesn't exist. So imagine seeing 13-year-old girls not working during school hours. So these girls were serving tables during the time that they should have been in school. They were cleaning his roof. So they would be on the roofs of his apartment building. They were servicing and taking care of apartments. And they were literal children. And nobody said anything. No, nobody did a damn thing about it. And, luckily, the way that this man was brought to justice was through a deep tragedy when there was a fire in one of his buildings and one of the young girls died, and the other workers wrapped her body in a rug and tried to smuggle it out. And then
Ugh.
smuggling it out, they dropped the rug and her body rolled out into the street. So in the wake of that, a bystander saw that, and a woman named Marsha Poole, she said, "You're not going anywhere. I'm calling the police." She called the police, and that's what unveiled what happened. And this young woman was pregnant with this baby, and there was, a really difficult, journey to get him held accountable, and eventually he was. And that's how we got some of the first trafficking and also the first instance of caste on the books.
Mm.
But watching that as a young Dalit woman leader, I was only 4 years older than the girls there. It was an accident that I was born in the United States and they were born in a situation where they could be so exploited. And also to see there was hundreds of people that showed up not to defend those girls, but to defend that caste rapist.
Oh,
And I watched our community just come through and say all sorts of things like, it was a misunderstanding. Actually, he didn't know. We know that there was consent. I don't know how a
oh my
13-year-old that
God.
has their passport and is undocumented can consent to this. But every major Indian association in the country wrote a letter on behalf of him, not on because of the girls. So to me, this was like such a deeply politicizing moment as a young Dalit woman, was that I realized, we are not going to be able to end caste as singular individuals. We need a comprehensive institutional response. We
Yeah.
need a civil rights organization. And so when I was able to collaborate with other Dalit to launch Equality Labs, and ever since then, we've done research, we've done organizing and advocacy work to really bring caste equity to as many American institutions as we can.
You just described like 4 lifetimes worth of work in one segment. I am sure, as others are like processing this, thank you for sharing the personal element. And it does help understand like where your fuel comes from, like that fire to keep moving, because that's atrocious. And it's very interesting for, I think like if you're in the US, you feel like you understand like all the different layers and complexities of this country, but every other country is just India. And like all of the complexities that come with that are not understood. And so thank you for unpacking it. I would be super curious, as you're describing kind of one area and like the line of work that you've worked in, but when it comes to that system kind of crossing shores and permeating different industries, what are some of the things like you see? Let's start with tech, because you've got a lot of tech workers here. What are some of the things that you see unique to tech right now with this
Well,
system?
I think even before going to just the workplace area, I
Yeah.
want to just do a little drawback because, you know, our organization was one of the first organizations to document caste discrimination in the United States. And,
Mhm.
you know, my colleague will drop a link to our survey. But essentially, just to give you a baseline, you know, caste oppressed Americans are actually one of the most discriminated Asian American groups in the country. And the
Mhm.
rates of discrimination we face are pretty high. So 1 in 4 Dalit Americans experience physical and verbal assault. 2 out of 3 experience workplace discrimination, and 1 out of 3 experience education discrimination in educational environments. And so, because of that, you know, over 50% of all Dalits that we survey said that they would prefer to be in the closet versus coming forward.
Right.
And so, it's that landscape that I think makes our workplaces difficult places for caste oppressed people to access the workplace with equal rights. And I think this really came into a national conversation with this very pivotal case in 2020. Where the California Department for Fairness in Employment and Housing sued the Cisco Corporation for caste discrimination. And what the complainant, his name is John Doe, because he had to even be anonymous in his complaint because of the fear of reprisal. What he talked about was that, you know, his supervisors knew his background.
Yeah.
And he alleged that, you know, in knowing his background, they would start to use his caste as a way to denigrate him, silo him from his work product, and eventually move him to term. While other people who were of other caste backgrounds were able to succeed at the same time. And his descriptions of a casteist hostile workplace, you know, I think that the DFEH found credible enough that at the end of their just, you know, their investigation, they laid a suit. And
Mhm.
in the wake of that, you know, hundreds of Dalit workers across the United States reached out to Equality Labs. They were at every major company, you know, from Google to Adobe to Netflix to Cisco and Microsoft about the conditions people were facing. And I think the things that people are talking about are severe. You know, they're talking about open slurs, open caste slurs in the workplace. They're talking about caste-based sexual violence where there's sexual harassment and worse. They're also talking about, you know, being denied promotions and a forward path up to the company. And in worst cases, just outright termination. And many people who hear those complaints don't need to have expert PhD levels, understanding of what caste is to know that civil rights grievances are occurring, and that, you know, caste oppressed employees are really struggling in very discriminatory workplaces. And in a survey that we are just about to release, we found that, you know, close to 50% of all Dalit tech workers talked about caste discrimination in
Mm.
their tech workplaces. And so I think that what we're seeing is a pretty severe set of conditions. And I think that we've also seen many companies want to act proactively on this because nobody wants to be the next Cisco.
Yeah.
And I also think people aren't waiting for data to make these transformations because the civil rights obligations for employees is it doesn't take a data set, it just takes one. And that's really, there's enough both anecdotal and data collected around this issue at this point that we've got to do something about it. Because again, tech is very unique because of where talent comes from, you know. So in the work of the Subramaniam, we know that, you know, people are coming from institutes in India, and these institutions themselves are casteist, and then they basically have casteist alumni networks that get activated through the internal referral processes of many tech companies. So many departments end up being consisting of like 1 or 2 castes because of that internal referral process. And then once you're in the company, you're dealing with all of these casteist norms that have been established by previous folks that are there. And some of this is not legible oftentimes to multiracial multiracial team members, which is why caste equity competency is so critical for whatever workforce that you're in, because many employees refer to the fact, like, I remember this one employee said, well, why on earth would I go to HR when actually they probably don't even know where India is on the map.
Yeah.
So caste is here. It happens across many faiths. So I've dealt with, caste oppressed Christians and Muslims, as well as people from Hindu and Sikh backgrounds who have all seen caste discrimination from their peers. So it's really agnostic to faith, and it's why we've asked for caste to be made more explicit as a protected category, because while it's there, like generally if someone who's Dalit is experiencing something, they can technically ask for help right now.
Yeah.
The reality is that unless companies make it explicit, they have other things like the caste equity training,
Yeah.
collecting data. They can't set, and if you don't collect data, you can't set KPIs, right? So it's all we all know, like, what the DEI journey is, but to really activate that for caste oppressed peoples, we have to acknowledge the problem is there, and government agencies are doing that all around the country. And I think this is why we want more companies to take this on. And luckily we've seen both management and employees from many companies being really aggressive on this issue because of how pervasive the violence is.
So let me kind of break, you mentioned a couple of different things and I want to break some of them down. So I think, the first time we were chatting, we talked a little bit about, like, yes, we're in tech, but I think you mentioned some pretty kind of not shocking, but horrible statistics in other industries. And I want to give a nod to those before we kind of dive into tech. Do you mind just talking a little bit about those? I think we talked about, like, restaurant workers. I'm trying to remember the rest of them. Do you mind sharing?
So we own, the only data we have for the other sectors is actually education, which is that
Okay.
1 in 3 folks, Dalits who took our survey said that they experienced some form of discrimination in education,
Okay.
and 2 out of 3 of all workers that are Dalit said that. So we have that blanket piece of data.
Yeah.
And obviously I think, like, what this is a call for is that we're in a data gap related to caste, which
Yeah.
really doesn't make sense in terms of sectors like tech, because their biggest markets are in South Asia, right? Everybody wants to capture the South Asia market because the Chinese market is closed. Well, we are the largest minority, and a minority in the South Asian context isn't 100,000, 200,000. We're talking about anywhere from 300 to 500 million across all of the subcontinent, right?
Yeah.
We're a very significant portion of the population, and to not just understand how caste impacts these workplaces isn't just a conversation about us doing better and being a morally appropriate company. It's actually about good business practice, because you can't design for this populace if you don't actually know what makes us tick. And guess what? Bias and discrimination makes nobody tick, and it makes for shitty products. So it's really a good thing to be able to turn to this conversation. And it's in the mandate of most folks, particularly after George Floyd, to commit to DEI, particularly in significant, in populations that face such significant violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, well, I want to get into some of the controversial pieces that kind of got us to this talk today. I will say, I see Sandeep has a raised hand. We are doing written Q&A, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to come up with it. When people hear, like, references to IIT, or the references to Hinduism, frankly, there have been some reactions that are kind of like, wait, you can't paint us all with the same brush. Not everyone from IIT is, like, complicit in caste discrimination, or, not every Hindu is caste. Like, what do you say to folks like that? How do you kind of bring them into the conversation?
So I think that there's actually two kind of, I think, important ways to address this. And the first thing is that we don't have to prove that institutions have structural bias. We already know that they do. That's why we're talking about how we address racial and gender bias. So caste is really part of a similar process in terms of us understanding what we need to shift and transform, you know, to talk about looking and examining caste discrimination, particularly in South Asian institutions, is one of the leading conversations of the hour, given how severe the discrimination is. Like, for example, you know, in talking about the Cisco case, all of those folks were part of the IIT Mumbai, which is a tech university in Mumbai. And that university was so intense because you had a professor there for whom two of his Dalit employees drank poison and tried to kill themselves on his doorstep because of the open slurs and threats that he used against them. That is the level of discrimination at the faculty level. And then even in terms of like where people live and how people engage in terms of, you know, the dining is segregated, you know, and many Dalit students talk about the kinds of harassment that they face. And it's so large that there's this phenomenon called institutional murder, where many Dalit and indigenous students try to kill themselves because of the kinds of harassment and slurs that they face. So no one is make an argument that IITs are not casteist. However, I think what you're speaking to is that there are some people who get uncomfortable with the discussion of caste, you know, and they may come from dominant caste backgrounds. Maybe they come from a particular religious background. And I think that that's okay. We can have the ability to disagree with each other. We can also just be able to slow down when we face anxiety and stress, and really, you know, a level of fragility that comes into the conversations, because very few people are used to hearing a caste depressed person talk openly about what the conditions of caste have done to us. So, you know, if you've heard of the term racial stress, which is the way people somatize the experience of racial bias and discrimination in their body, whether they're of racial privilege or if they're someone who's a racial minority, being able to be more cognizant about the impacts of racial stress has helped people find new ways to approach fragility, as opposed to just shutting down and letting your survival response come into play. So similarly, Tanuja, like a lot of the work that we do at Equality Labs has been to really have people not just learn the cognitive pieces of what it means to unlearn caste supremacy, but to be more aware of what's happening in their bodies. Because I think, you know, just in terms of the South Asian community, not, you know, for, you know, multiracial conversations related to caste equity, but really within the South Asian community, caste is our fundamental historical trauma. We have very little language in order to be able to have, you know, just and equitable conversations with each other, and our nervous systems are wired for oppression. So there are, you know, at very few bits of conversation occur without people going from 0 to 100 and assuming not only the worst of each other, but also the worst of what it means to have a conversation about caste equity. But just because a conversation is uncomfortable doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. Because too often we are allowing discomfort to be the barrier from us to be able to re-examine what it would mean to come back into humanity with each other.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's a big part of where I feel we have a lot to unlearn together. And so, you know, I appreciate that sometimes, you know, hearing the experiences of Dalit people talking about the pain of caste equity can be painful for someone who is of caste privilege, because they might have to confront, maybe I had complicity with that, or maybe there was times people said things and I didn't say anything, or this makes me feel like I'm on the defensive. Those are all good feelings to know, but they don't require action. They actually, you know, require an addressal at the body level, which is why you need to have mindfulness practice with these DEI processes, because frankly, a lot of times people aren't even having the same conversation because their bodies are reacting in a totally different way. And certainly, I think for a lot of the folks that are not South Asian that are listening here, you guys can probably relate to this conversation from the context of race or gender or sexual orientation. The reality is, social media has made us, has like basically engendered the worst
Mm.
of our survival mechanisms in terms of how to have courageous conversations. And we need to reassert a slower timeline so we have greater literacy of our bodies while we try to move forward through these traumas and get on the other side of it, as humans together.
Well, that really like strikes a chord, because I think you've got a number of folks on this chat today and zooming in that working on like diversity and equity and inclusion programming within their different workspaces. And the conversation in this country at least has changed in the last 2 years because of George Floyd's murder, and you've got people that are having to confront their own complicity with racism in this country, and those conversations, like, you can see people tense up, you can feel it, and the language is charged. I am very curious, like, what your advice would be to folks on this call who are in facilitator positions to have some of these conversations. Aside from like slowing down, are there other things that you would say would be important to bring to those conversations, to bring to the workplace? Any other guidance?
So I think that one model that we've used very successfully in terms of equality labs has been to use the work of, Black Buddhist mindfulness practitioners and also somatic abolitionists like Resma Menachem. And, one person I really want to name is like Ruth King, who wrote a book called Mindfulness of Race, and Rhonda McGee, who also does mindfulness and racial awareness work. And one of the things I've learned from both of those amazing Buddhist practitioners has been some of what we need to do is be able to, usually you have like a trigger, you act right away, right? It's like one step from the trigger to action. And Ruth has this model where she basically has this model called RAIN. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it stands for like recognize, awareness, investigate, and nurture. And what it does is it basically adds 3 other steps from the trigger to action, where you can, one, separate yourself from the trigger. So it's not that I just feel rage. It's like there's me and there's anger. And then there's investigating why this brought up anger. And then the action that is encouraged isn't just about like a dishum or like a fight back. You kind of explore what are all the things you might do for a trigger that actually centers your nurturing. Because sometimes imagine as a person of color, you're in a situation where it's like, I just heard the craziest ass thing on that Slack channel. Oh my God, I'm going to set fire to 10 buildings if I don't know what's going on. And then that's when like the regretful message gets thrown out, and then boom, everything explodes. And then you're in like a group conversation, which you really just want to pull your hair out, right? But the thing is that, you have other steps you could do. Like maybe it's like what I do is I call my friend and process. Then I can, once I've actually de-escalated my nervous system, I can think about what the more strategic response is. Or is a response even an individual response versus a structural or HR response, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like we're not even able to have enough space for us to embody what the consequences of bad triggers are, because we go right to action because we're not allowed to be human in the face of so much trauma. So that extension of time, that ability to breathe and settle, that's also about us humanizing ourselves in the face of dehumanization. And I think so many of these lessons around caste are so analogous to race, because all of us know what it's like to be partially bodied people in workplaces that don't
Mm.
as people of color, right?
Yeah.
whether it's at current or past institutions, you just learn to kind of like keep your head down and move on, right?
Yeah.
But some of what we're doing with somatics, in the context of being embodied in terms of our commitments to social justice, is to reclaim the body in
Yeah.
of all this pain. And that doesn't mean every container is going to be met for it within a workplace, but to not acknowledge that we need those containers helps us be more strategic about the tactics and the goals that we might use afterwards. So, but I think it required me as someone who's a caste oppressed person to also just acknowledge I hurt a lot. It was
Mhm.
painful. It's painful to be dehumanized. It's painful to face gaslighting every day and that you cannot speak your truth all the time.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people live in closets that they never wanted to be in order to be able to live their lives. And because you're dehumanized in one institution doesn't mean you can't be rehumanized with another network of caring and loving people. But we have to know it. We have to name that. We have to ask for that and demand that as we go forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's always this jump to just action of, oh, we got to fix it. Something's happened. And it's like, take a breath, actually acknowledge the people affected, including yourself. Actually, I do have to remark, I see a comment here around dishum. If you are not familiar with the expression dishum, this is exactly how we refer to like fighting and explosions in Indian and Pakistani films. It was like right on point. So I appreciate that dishum in there.
It's
Um,
kind of like our version of BAM or powwow, like you see in comics. You would just see like "Dishoom" in like
yeah.
big letters across the screen.
This is how my mom would refer to my brother and I. We were playing at home. She's like, enough of the dishum dishum, like stop it. So I have to call that out. I want to take a few minutes. We've talked about kind of the DEI programming and things like that. And then of course there's elements of intersectionality within the Dalit community as well. Can you talk a little bit about the unique kind of discrimination against Dalit women and what you've seen?
Sure. I mean, I think that, Dalit women face, a type of violence that we call caste-based sexual violence, where, on top of the exclusion related to the system of caste, there's a unique way that our bodies are used to shame our community through sexual violence. And there's a whole spectrum, like from people publicly shaving your head, stripping us naked, and making us walk in the village, to even more public dehumanization, as well as the sexual trafficking and targeting of minors. So these are all kind of traditional caste practices. And even though, when I talked about the Lucky Bali Reddy case, I think
Mhm.
that case really draws upon that tradition. He didn't see anything wrong with it because his family has done things like that from a long period of time. Landlords. So it's very much, I think, also similar to the slave plantation system in the United States. Because dominant caste landlords have access to the land, they have access to the people for also their predation. So in some villages, the first person that a woman sleeps with is not her husband. If they're an agricultural worker, it's the landlord. So there's a long tradition of this exploitation. And I think that a lot of what Dalit women speak about is the fact that education and us being able to be lifted out of our caste professions is the key to us, really, leaving behind Brahminical patriarchy, which is the way we talk about caste and gender in our context. And I think that's why I was so heartbroken when we worked with a bunch of, Dalit women tech workers
Mm.
who spoke about caste-based sexual harassment and gender-based violence in American tech workplaces. And there was a statement that they released through the Washington Post that was just heartbreaking to read, because these women, they had traveled all of this distance to escape caste. They had gone into the field of STEM, in which there's very few Dalit women that are working at that high level in the tech field. And even then they were harassed. And even then there was like the targeting of them based on their caste background. So it's a very deeply seated project that we want to basically address and transform.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a question kind of leading up to this talk was like, well, how the question was literally, well, how do y'all know if someone is Dalit or not? Because we can't tell. And I appreciated her candor in the question. She was a young white woman. Um, when you get a question like that, which was well-meaning from this place of, I want to help protect someone I know is minority, like, what do you kind of do with that question? How do you take that on?
Well, I think what people have to understand is that the condition for most caste oppressed people is an experience where there's no incentive for them to come out in their workplaces, particularly if caste is not as a protected category. So there's a lot of work around creating safe spaces in people's workplaces that is really the need of the hour, because, and I think that starts with adding caste as a protected category, having public trainings related to caste equity, inviting and celebrating, Dalit history events and months and figures are all crucial ways to let caste oppressed employees know they have safe harbor, in the company. But the reality is that you don't need a Dalit person to come out and tell you what's going on for an organization to be in liability with them not protecting the rights of caste oppressed people. And it's really, you want to think about this as an example of other protected classes like sexual orientation and gender.
Exactly.
You don't go up and ask people, oh my God, are you queer? Or,
Yeah.
are you trans? Like, I'm just, you don't, it's actually against the law to ask people. Similarly, it is against the law to ask for someone to out themselves in terms of their caste background. However, protected categories and non-discrimination policies are there so that people who are of those protected classes can avail themselves if they need it when they face discrimination. And that will help HR then figure out what they need to do in relationship to the investigation of the mindset of the person who inflicted that harm.
Yeah.
But it's not needed to be able to, there's not a tell, right? Like, and oftentimes, like, what we do is we help build people's caste equity competencies by giving people an example of certain social locators, or like, to give you an example, we know in their offices in India segregated the vegetarian food from the meat food, and then they put the meat food, and eating meat is a sign of being from a caste oppressed background. They put the meat food by the bathroom, so people who were eating meat had to go there, so it was very obvious that they were being denigrated in that context. And so it was, it's things like that, which, that are clear, like microaggressions, as well as open slurs. Like, there's a lot that an HR or whoever's responsible for cultures of belonging can do to create a more welcoming space. And I guarantee you, usually when you do that, within like a year of kind of putting those programs and processes together, people slowly start to come out. But there's no incentive for people to come out if caste isn't added as a protected category, because there's no protections. They know that usually for a company to add it, it means that they've really done the due diligence to train their HR teams to make it a safe space. And I think that means everything to be able to begin to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I compared it to sexual orientation when I had the conversation with her, but and veteran status. But there's kind of two related questions that I do want to see if we can help address on while we're on this topic right here. One is, as a young Indian girl, how can I help protect and fight for the peoples, which I think you've kind of touched on. But I don't know if you'd say anything to like youth who aren't necessarily in the workplace yet. Would there be anything different you would advise them?
Sure. So if there's people that want to get involved or be part of the caste abolition movement, I really recommend that people follow us on our socials. We have a lot of activities relating to Dalit History Month that we'd love to kind of invite folks to. We also have a caste abolition giving circle where people are committing to help support the battle for, caste civil rights, and, getting pledges and moving towards, moving funds towards supporting this important work. But I also think it's really, really critical for folks to begin to unlearn their caste supremacy. And so we have an Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop that we'll have one that's starting in May, where people can really start to dig deep around these issues and work together to kind of unlearn it in their bodies and in their minds and in their spirits, you know? So I think there's learning, there's advocacy, there's organizing, and then there's being an upstander. You know, we frankly can't really allow for this kind of discrimination to continue. If you see something, we really want you to be able to stand with that caste oppressed person, because the burden of transforming institutions can't be on the excluded, because of the tremendous risk and pain and violence that exists around that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you address this, but I do want to make sure that I ask this question kind of verbatim here. When you were talking about the protected class category, the person asks, as I understand it, CSU has added caste as an explicit parenthetical, right, to race or ethnicity, and UC Davis has it included as an explicit part of the definition of national origin in their anti-discrimination policies. So first, I think you've already said yes, it's helpful to explicitly call out caste as a harm reduction measure. But if you had to kind of pick between the way it's done, these two options, do you consider them both imperfect? Is there another way you'd want them done, or how do you feel?
Well, I think like with sexual orientation and with gender, it really makes sense for us to have caste explicitly made its own category,
Yeah.
because it's imperfect when it's part of race and national origin. And sometimes I've seen it even be part of faith, because the reality is that it's a combination of all of them, which is why at an intergovernmental level, it is seen as a separate category, you know? So when you have something as a separate category, you can ensure that training and accountability and growth towards those communities really occurs. And so I think that would be my preference. And certainly I think like some of the most intense labor law challenges are happening around caste oppressed cases, you know? So currently we have the Cisco case that's like working its way through California courts. And also in New Jersey, we have a case called the BAPS case, where, you know, a religious institution there basically trafficked hundreds of workers and paid them $1.20 an hour to do back-baking stone labor. And you know, that really just kind of, you know, the Cisco case was bad enough. But with that BAPS case, because there's 5 temples across the country that are being activated, this is why major unions are activated on the issue of caste. So, you know, APALA, the Asian American arm of the AFL-CIO, did a huge caste resolution, and they're asking all workers that employ Asian American communities to add caste as a protected category. The California Trade Justice Coalition, which is made up of all of the major unions in the state, including SEIU, and the nurses union, you know, has also weighed in on the issue of caste. And the Democratic Party of California, one of the largest political parties in the country, state parties in the country, added caste as a protected category. Yeah. So people realize that this is an issue, it's not going away. And, you know, while Dalits are a minority within a minority, we are a significant contributor to major industries, and all of the exploitation cases that we're seeing are being made in terms of our community, which is why we really think that this is something that we want to encourage as many people responsible for cultures of belonging to get ahead of, and work with institutions like Equality Lives to get that caste equity in place and really, you know, move past the discrimination and bias, but get to a place where we can make safe places for all workers, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will add that, you know, when we met, I talked a little bit about like the work on ending forced arbitration was like, so all these claims of harm could actually see the light of day in court and justice, right? And so when I think about, I see a couple of colleagues who are organizers here, it's like, great, you know, we get caste first named as a protected category. And then if those cases then just get shunted and do forced arbitration, justice is still denied. And so this is part of like why we need to see this through all the way. We need structural reform and how we actually pursue these cases so that they are actually pursued in court. I will say this, we've got a few minutes left. I want to wrap. on this question because it's a history month that you founded. Like, what do you hope people remember from this month and also celebrate from this month?
Well, I think, I had a very selfish reason why I was one of the co-founders of Dalit History Month. And that was because when I first started this work and I looked up Dalit women,
Yeah.
the first 30 or 40 images I saw were of Dalit women raped and mangled and desecrated. That was, or porn. That was literally all that you saw. And that was because Dalit women were not significantly present anywhere, and people didn't know who we were beyond our violence. And that's not a tenable place for any community. You can't build a future in murder, or rape. And so many of us who were the co-founders of the Dalit History Month project, we were all women who worked on issues of caste-based sexual violence. And we said, we want another way forward, And so in going back to our histories and seeing how long of all these powerful ancestors, people like Dr. Ambedkar, who was the architect of the Indian Constitution, and women and authors like Bama, who've inspired huge generations through her words, or Savitribai Phule, and her husband Jyotibai Phule, who did the first women's school in the subcontinent and transformed another way to approach the denigration of women in the subcontinent. It just felt that, we have an alternative history we can draw from to build radical visionary futures. And so when I hope that people come to Dalit History Month, they see more than a people that have been brutalized. They see a people that are thriving and that are resilient and beautiful and just shining in incredible joy and power. And I love it when people are able to tap into Dalit joy, because Dalit joy has been one of the remarkable, things that I have that are what my family has given to me, because, I'm here because of 1,000 generations of love. There's no way that you could be here under such backbreaking, dehumanizing violence unless you ancestor that loved you so much, that maybe ate a little less rice so that they could give their rice to their child so their child could come forward. And to have such a remarkable lineage of love, I know that I'm an ambassador of hope and possibility. I'm here because someone dreamed of a radical girl who could just, dismantle all the tables of oppression and create a community that could thrive and live with other similar dreamers. And that's where all of us are here. We want to inherit a world of bias and discrimination. We want to build that radical feminist future where we're all free. And sometimes we take hits, but oftentimes we carry each other past those hits to that broader, beautiful vision of possibility. And that's what Dalit History Month is. I think to carry the water. And when we're not able to, when it's just so dark and it feels so hard, before you know it, someone else just gives you a hand and lifts you up. That's how I know our community has survived. And it's what we've learned in terms of our alliances and relationships with other communities, is that our material internationalist solidarities are what actually gets us beyond the racism, the Islamophobia and the Dalit phobia that we see. So I hope people really walk away knowing that we're here to talk about power, and we're also here, especially in the case of Equality Labs, to talk about radical Dalit feminist futures, these multiverses that can heal and bring us connected beyond trauma into a new imagined future together.
The perfect way to end this talk. I don't have words for thank you. We need new words. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone who tuned in. I know this is the middle of a work day for you, but it was so special to be together. We will post this taping as well so other folks can enjoy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again.
Oh, no, thank you everyone for joining. And again, track us on our socials, join our giving circle, and be part of the movement. We want to see all humans on deck. So looking forward, and, just thank you again. And thank you, Tanuja and Liz, for creating such a wonderful space together.